Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1130 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. So if you're not aware, Oda's going on a 2-week break after this chapter to do research. And if I had to guess, that research is probably going to have a lot to do with Norse mythology, because this chapter felt straight out of an epic Norse myth. Honestly, everything about this is perfect. We even said this in the last chapter review of look, I haven't spent much time talking about Norse mythology despite our expectation that Elbaf is going to relate heavily to Norse just because it hadn't really been an emphasis of the beginning chapters of Elbaf. Well, here it is, and it is glorious. I'm just gonna warn you right now, we're gonna talk about Norse mythology, and probably a lot about Loki. It is kind of funny though that we complained after the last chapter of One Piece, and it's like, you know what, sometimes, or most of the time, Oda knows what he's doing. This is the Elbaf that I was hoping for before we began Elbaf, and Oda introduced it with a freaking dawn. If this chapter is anything that we can judge on, Elbaf is going to be awesome. Oh yeah, it kind of goes without saying that I am fully erect at the moment, okay? TMI, I understand, but this, yes, I'm here for it. Just one of the things that you lose over time, the further that you get into One Piece, is the sense of awe. I guess that's the best way to phrase it. Pre-time skip, we had admirals and we had Yonko that were just so far above where our characters were that being in their presence was just incredibly awesome. But now Luffy is a Yonko and some of that mystique is lost, which is why this chapter was pure genius, because I feel that feeling, a legend coming to life. But there are a lot of things to discuss, so without further ado, we got an update for the strats, not in the diorama, not in Elbaf, and they've basically been looking for Luffy and the ship for a while now, and at this point they've given up. I thought it was a really cool detail that Oda remembered that Jinbei can talk to whale sharks. So their searching power in the ocean is actually pretty extremely high. But the way that Oda framed it in the chapter is that the Strats' belief in each other is kind of infectious. They totally shrug off the disappearance of their ship and their crew, while the Giants seemed kind of concerned initially, but when they were so confident, it was like, okay, I guess everything will work out, let's party some more. It's just a cool detail. But despite nothing really happening, I do find myself excited for what this group of the Strats is ultimately going to do. Because clearly, there's going to be stories for both groups. At this point, we can kind of imagine what Luffy's story might be. But what's happening here is still really open-ended, aside from potentially following the trail of Luffy's chaos. From here, we pan back to Luffy, and they've escaped the diorama to finally get a real look at the island of Elbaf. So we discovered that we were actually inside of what was a really impressive castle situated in the snowy mountains just below the giant Elbaf tree. Actually, it turned out to be the case that the castle in the diorama was almost a perfect replica of this castle, minus the incredible geography. But I'm just over here thinking, there is no way that this is just where Road lives. This is not Road's home. And I think it substantiates the idea that Road is, his job is as warden of this castle, which is, supposed to be a prison. If it wasn't clear before, it's explained explicitly in this chapter that trespassing in Elbaf is illegal. In a weirdly similar but different way as Wano, the borders are closed. In Wano, right, you couldn't leave the island, but in Elbaf, you can't visit. This came up because the Strats had the sense to avoid giants before they knew more, and we ended up seeing Gerd and Goldberg, other members of the new giant warrior pirates, under Hajrudin, visiting Road. It turns out that they are not big fans of Road. Elbaf is supposed to be closed, but Road doesn't seem to care about that because he literally captures people and then takes them to this castle, and they know that. They literally called him a shame of Elbaf. But we'll talk more about this a little later on. We also see a giant bridge which connects the castle to the tree, and after the Strats avoided Gerd and Goldberg, they ended up traveling across this bridge. And just my impression is, what makes the most sense to me is that there's probably multiple of these castles situated around the island of Elbaf. I just find myself doubting that there's only one castle and one bridge that leads up to the higher levels of the tree. But just something that I notice, and I want to point out to you guys, I have no idea whatsoever if this is important, but as the Strats cross the bridge, we can see that there's wolves underneath. Terrifyingly giant wolves. And then my brain is like, well, this reminds me a lot for some reason of Tequila Wolf. Tequila Wolf is also a bridge. The idea of booze and of wolves associated with the giants of Elbaf in this castle is like something that just works in my brain. We also know that Tequila Wolf has counterpart bridges also named after wolves. Being named after wolves just in the first place is something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me right now. So just a thought out into the abyss, but is the world government inspired in some way by Elbaf? I'm wondering. It's also interesting because we've already had the giant Dory and Brogy referred to the red line as the serpent soaked in blood. This was like one of the first theories that I ever made. And the idea is that the giants thought of the red line as the world serpent, or the Midgard serpent. In Norse mythology, the world serpent, or the Midgard serpent, whose name was Jormungandr, encircled Midgard, biting its own tail to form a perfect circle, similar to the red line. So in effect, these bridges in Elbaf leading to higher levels of the tree is very similar to the bridges in the greater One Piece world leading to the highest points of the world above the red line, guarded by the world serpent. But for now, it is just a thought. I have no idea where to take this. Just saying stuff. But anyway, the scope of Elbaf and the fact that everything around them is made for giants is just a really interesting environment to be in. Poor Usopp, the only thing that's scarier than crossing a wooden rickety bridge in the middle of an ice storm is doing so on a bridge made for giants where the gaps between the planks requires you to jump. Oh yeah, and if you fall through, then you land in the middle of a den of wolves. Giant-sized wolves. We're already testing Usopp's bravery. But it's here that Oda and Luffy decide to point out to us that there's some presence on the island which is interesting. Luffy calls it a roar. And just as an aside, this is something that I would normally expect Zoro and Sanji to notice as well. But Zoro actually asks Luffy, before he reveals this, he asks him, what's wrong? And it almost gives me the impression that this is something that not even Zoro can notice. Which I understand is a very unpopular thing to say or even suggest, but it's just the impression that I got from the chapter. Has Luffy surpassed Zoro by that much? But needless to say, when there is some kind of intriguing mystery, you know that Luffy is going to investigate. Zoro also wanted to involve himself, but thankfully we have Sanji there to inform him that this is a forest and forests are off limits for you. People say that the strats don't learn and grow. I present to you Exhibit A. So Luffy takes it upon himself to jump off the bridge into the Den of Wolves because he just doesn't care. And at the end of the chapter, Luffy stumbles upon what this roar was. It's an impressive looking giant, eyes bandaged, chained to a tree or to a rock. Despite Luffy not saying anything, the giant immediately asks, "State your name." And of course, Luffy does the Luffy thing of, "I'm Luffy, I'm gonna be king of the pirates. Where is this place and who are you?" And the giant reveals to Luffy that he is in Elbaf, and that he is Loki, the sun god who will bring about the end of the world. So let's just take a break here and acknowledge the insane aura that this scene has. You know, right? Come on, we all know we were expecting Loki to be like this derpy Orochi-like character. We were all thinking it. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. Loki is intense, treated like a legendary monster straight out of a mythology. Guys, I cannot tell you how badly I needed this feeling. There is somebody here who is a legitimate threat to Luffy. That is my impression. That's what the chapter is telling me, and Oda made it make sense in the chapter. Let me lay out how brilliant this is. So it began actually a little bit earlier in the chapter when we got bounty updates for Dory and Brogy. The Straw Hats still traveling with the giants got newspapers. It was revealed that the Big News Morgans has painted Luffy out to be the killer of Vegapunk. Lilith has herself a good laugh about that. There's some commentary about the consistently fake news. And then we get a reveal of the bounties of Dory and Brogy, which is now 1.8 billion, slotting them above Yonko commanders such as Katakuri and King, which is quite a bit higher than the 100,000 when they were first introduced. But the logic behind this is inflation, remarkably on point. Dory and Brogy had been fighting in Little Garden for 100 years, so basically their bounties were frozen for 100 years. It's essentially revealed that 100 years ago, the top captains of the pirate world were given bounties approximately of 100,000. 100 years ago, the giant warrior pirates Dory and Brogy were very near Yonko level. Now you might say that, well, when we met them in Little Garden, they didn't seem that strong. But you also gotta remember that they were fighting every day for 100 years. Even more than that, they were fighting essentially all day, every day. I think that it's fair to assume that they were tired. And so the reason that this is so brilliant is this now creates an Elbaf which matches all of the setup for Elbaf from the beginning of the story as the island, the strongest island in the entire world. We had a really off perspective about the power of the giants. So this leads to a conversation about Loki. Dory and Brogy explained to the Strats, not currently on Elbaf, that Elbaf has a prince named Loki. They actually say Elbaf has another prince because Hajrudin is also a prince. But they tell us that when Loki was born, they called him the Accursed Prince. They said he devoted himself to darkness, and a few years ago, he was sentenced to crucifixion. He tried to flee, but we warriors all came together to catch him. Frankie's like, what, all the warriors of Elbaf? Basically, it took the entire country of Elbaf to chain up Loki. But the giants continue, yeah, he's not right in the head. You see, there's a legendary devil fruit said to be passed down through the royal family. His desire to eat it was so great that he killed his own father, King Harold. That's why we won't let the Accursed Prince loose again. If Loki ever does escape, it'll be the end of everything. Those who follow the channel know that one of the things that excited me most about Elbaf is the fact that we've met several giants throughout the course of the story, but not one of them had a devil fruit, not in canon. There was always this lingering thought that there was likely to be a giant in Elbaf that surpassed our expectations of what giants can be, but also somebody that we hadn't actually met yet, a sort of lurking legend. And it is clear at the very least that this character is Loki. If it takes all the warriors of Elbaf to catch him and chain him up, and Dory and Brogy have 1.8 billion berry bounties, you're talking about a character who is Yonko level. He's just never left Elbaf. But yeah, all of this is super interesting, and I think that you can't help but think about Kaido. Kaido's introduction and Loki's introduction are just like, the feeling is similar. This dude is a unit. I'm not sure how much we should be reading into the TCB translation or not, but they said that he was sentenced to crucifixion, so like, he should have been sentenced to die for killing the king. But we've stumbled upon him in the forest and he is very much not dead. So kind of like Kaido, it paints a picture of a guy that literally cannot be killed. I'm also kind of wondering whether there's supposed to be similarities here with the introduction of Zoro. When we met Zoro, he was tied up in a similar way, and we also know that he wasn't allowed to eat. Has Loki been here not eating? Not for days, for years. Legitimate question. Normally, I wouldn't bring this up because there's just no way that that can be true. Regardless of how strong somebody is, they have to eat. Even Zoro, when he was tied up, he was only supposed to starve for a couple days. But with Loki also having a ambiguously vague legendary devil fruit, I feel like there's some possibility he doesn't need to eat. I don't know how much time I want to spend speculating about what Loki's devil fruit might be, just because it could literally be anything. But he calls himself, and he seems to believe himself to be the sun god. This is a special fruit that's passed down the royal family line of the giants of Elbaf. So to have something to do with light or the sun would make sense to me. Something like a Prometheus mythical zone. This would actually work in multiple ways because Prometheus stole fire from the gods, while Loki stole this devil fruit from the giants, who are godlike beings, and live in what we assume to be a metaphorical Asgard, land of the gods in Norse mythology. Also potentially fitting because in pop culture, Loki is often associated as a god of fire. Historians actually refute this hypothesis, but it's stuck around because of the similarities in ancient language between Loki and the word for fire, which is Logi. You heard that right. L-O-G-I, Germanic word for fire. And it just makes you wonder if there was another inspiration here for Oda's choice of the term Logia. He told us straight up that Vicky the Viking in Vikings was one of the primary inspirations of One Piece. It's clearly making its appearance in the endgame of the story. Not as far-fetched as you might think. We now have an eternal flame, which is like this incredible energy source which can be utilized to create anything. It also has something to do with Luffy and his Nika fruit, the sun god Nika, the sun god Loki, literally a flame. So for Logias, which are elemental-based fruits, to all essentially be related to fire in some way. I'm just saying. But yeah, just to remind everyone, Loki's fruit could literally be anything, and while I think that it having something to do with the sun god might be cool or fitting, there might be things here there might not, I think that pretty much anything that Oda does, so long as it matches with the idea of a legendary fruit, is going to be freaking awesome. But some different ideas to throw into the ether from a different perspective is Loki from Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, 3 of Loki's children are Hel, Jormungandr, the world serpent that we've already talked about, and Fenrir, basically a big wolf. All 3 of these as mythical zones would also be incredibly cool. And with the idea of Fenrir, I just kind of expect that to show up in some form in the arc, and we did already see big wolves below the bridge, basically right around where Loki is. Could mean something. And if Oda wants to take some liberties, it doesn't necessarily have to be Jormungandr the snake from Norse mythology, but something like a basilisk. I thought it was interesting to point out that Loki was blindfolded or his eyes were covered. Is it because his eyes have some kind of power? In which case being a basilisk would make a lot of sense. For those that read or watched Harry Potter, right, the basilisk in that story killed people when you looked into its eyes. This connection with the eyes, however, is also really interesting to me given the reveal that Hajrudin is Loki's older brother, also the son of the king. Probably the most defining aspect of Hajrudin's design is his helmet, and his helmet has little eyepieces which cover his eyes. It could make some sense for this to be like the official helmet of the prince that is supposed to inherit this legendary devil fruit which has some sort of eye power that could be deadly. And again, this could be meaningless, it might also have meaning. I'm just going to point it out to you that with Hajrudin's ship, on his mainsail, we see this dragon-looking creature wearing Hajrudin's helmet. Probably the most accurate way to describe the dragon is it looks a lot like Momonosuke when we first saw him transform before he became like a real dragon, but with wings. In my mind, this could be an interesting interpretation of a basilisk. We also see an interesting tattoo that is mostly obscured because of Loki's chains and his hair, but he has the tattoo of wings on his arms. If you remember about Kaido, before we officially learned Kaido's devil fruit, he had a tattoo of scales on him. That ended up being foreshadowing. But if I'm gonna be straight up with you, there's a really simple answer here for why Loki's eyes are covered that is most fitting to the character of Loki throughout all of history. If you had to pick one power which defined Loki from mythology, that power would be shapeshifting. Personally, I think that it would be shocking for Oda to design a character based on Loki and not have this character have the ability to change its form, because that character would not be Loki. So maybe Loki's eyes are covered because that is how he is able to change his form. Throughout the story of One Piece, Oda has, on occasion, had characters appear that look like Luffy, or change their appearance to look like Luffy, by whatever means. I'm just gonna say that. But yeah, I think that that's enough shots in the dark for now. Any of these ideas or something else entirely, I'm for it. But just in general, I'm curious about Loki's story. In fact, I'm curious about the entire story of Elbaf. So to begin with, it's kind of a shock that Hajrudin is actually a prince and the older brother of Loki, because he never really carried that presence whenever we saw him, either currently in the story or even as a child with Big Mom's flashback. Honestly, this one reveal alone has made Hajrudin so much more interesting to me, just from the sense that I'm getting that Hajrudin has really not lived up to expectations. If you put Loki on one side and Hajrudin on the other, which one do you think is more impressive? Seems to me to be Loki, and I feel like that has to mean something to Hajrudin. So whether it was when we saw him in Big Mom's flashback training under the Elder Giants, or more recently his pursuit of piracy, I wonder if Hajrudin is trying to get stronger. In a way, he could be very similar to Momonosuke, trying to become worthy of being king. Being overshadowed by his little brother is a big deal. I assume that the vast majority of people here have watched the Marvel movies or are tangentially aware of that universe. And so in that version of Norse, Loki and Thor are brothers. Therefore, I think that a thought that a lot of people are going to have right now is that Hajrudin is basically Thor. Their father, Harold, was Odin. But just as a fun fact, this interpretation of Norse in Marvel is not what is actually the case in Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, Loki and Thor are not brothers. But to go back to Marvel for a second, the dynamic in Marvel is that Loki is basically the black sheep, troublemaking child, while Thor is a legendary hero, favored by all, immensely more impressive than his brother. So if Hajrudin is Thor, this interpretation in One Piece does not seem to match this, which I think is interesting. Guys, the Loki from Norse mythology is an iconic character. It is one of the coolest characters ever created, period. And I think that this is accurately reflected in the Marvel universe. Like when you first begin the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you begin with a story about Thor, and Thor is just so much better than Loki. Loki is kind of a meme. But as you continue watching the MCU, an interesting phenomenon happens, which by the end, Loki is actually a far more important character than Thor. Loki literally breaks the universe. Sorry if I'm spoiling if you haven't seen the Loki TV show. But all of this from Marvel is inspired by the actual Loki. In Norse, Loki is this anti-hero hero. It is just as confusing as it sounds. The way that I would summarize him is that Loki is clever, yes. Loki is a trickster, Yes, but more so, Loki is the most competent of the gods. In all of the various stories, sometimes there's problems that only Loki is able to solve, and he actually solves these problems for the benefit of others. There are, of course, circumstances in which his trickster nature or his cleverness gets him into holes which he has to dig himself out of. But overwhelmingly, he does that. That is, up until the point that he commits this grave, unforgivable sin. Loki from Norse mythology ends up killing another god, Balder, the god of light, which casts the world into darkness. So just the same as the Loki that we see in the story of One Piece right now, as a result of his actions, Loki gets chained up and imprisoned. And there he exists for some amount of time, basically being endlessly tortured. The method of torture is also interesting. Snake venom is dripped into his eyes. So even if this isn't an explanation for why his eyes are covered, this is certainly an explanation for the Oda's general design of the scene that we meet Loki in here, chained to a rock, blindfolded. He got this from Norse mythology. But as we've already been talking about, as is the case all the time with Loki, he finds a way out of the hole that he digs for himself. Details aside, he escapes his prison and then essentially becomes the leader of chaos. The forces of chaos. The forces of evil during Ragnarok. Ragnarok being the big battle which leads to the destruction of the world. The world is actually destroyed, which by itself should tell you that in this battle of Ragnarok, Loki ultimately wins. Well, he sort of wins. Loki dies, along with all of the other gods, but the forces of chaos which he helmed prevailed. This also had a lot to do with another very important figure from Norse mythology known as Surtur. Basically this demonic, all-powerful fire giant, wielding a giant flaming sword. At this point, we haven't talked much about the Tree of Elbaf. We are getting there, but we do see what appears to be a giant sword. And this is like not an ordinary giant sword. This sword would be giant to a giant. It would even be giant to a continent puller such as Oars. So naturally, a question that a lot of people have right now is like, who was supposed to wield this sword? And while the obvious answer to this is Luffy, because Luffy is freedom and probably can make himself large enough that this sword would make sense. It might also have something to do with the legendary devil fruit that Loki now possesses. As for ideas of what this devil fruit could be, I'm just gonna throw in another idea while we're here. The mythical zone, Surtur, making the user a fiery being large enough to naturally wield the sword, which will burst with flame. Are you guys seeing what I'm seeing? Can you picture the vision and why immediately this chapter has me just over the top excited? Because I picture in my mind a giant Luffy fighting a giant Surtur, both the size of the island of Elbaf. Just the same as Loki in Norse mythology, the arc of Elbaf sits at this interesting precipice of like the last arc before the world breaks, the last arc before Ragnarok begins. I'm telling you, Oda consistently does this, where at the beginnings of arcs foreshadow what ultimately happens in clever ways. And almost the first panel that we get when we arrive in Elbaf is a threat to the fake Yggdrasil inside of the diorama designed after the actual Elbaf. The residents of Legoland are worried about the tree catching fire. So I see this happening in the actual arc of Elbaf. Yggdrasil burns, the whole tree. For this to be as a result of the mythical zone Surtur fruit makes so much sense it's wild. Also the fact that Loki considers himself to be the sun god. If you're curious, this is my official prediction. But at the same time, we preface this whole conversation, this whole tangent with the idea that Loki is an anti-hero hero. And the reason this makes so much sense is because in Norse mythology, the destruction of the world is not painted as a bad thing. It's painted as an inevitable thing, something that occurs cyclically over the ages. And then from the ashes of the destroyed world, a new world arises that is better than the one that came before. I'm not entirely sure how far into the rabbit hole I'm actually able to explain to you, so some of this you're just gonna have to take my word for it. But theories exist that Loki actually didn't kill Balder. Balder, the god of light, which was the great crime that Loki committed that basically left him imprisoned and tortured. Because after Ragnarok ends, Balder returns. This is actually a concept with the gods that comes up on several occasions, for instance with Odin. They purposefully die in order to obtain some new power. So actual theories exist that Loki was instructed by Odin to kill Balder, and then punished for it. And maybe some context about the gods will better flesh out your understanding of them. The gods were not good guys. They were consistently portrayed as the rulers of the world that were steadily falling into depravity. You could rightly compare them to the celestial dragons in the world of One Piece. Power corrupts. So in this way, it can be argued pretty persuasively that Loki is actually the hero of this story. Loki instigating Ragnarok leading to the fall of the gods was a good thing. And Loki, because of his experiences, and also because he's the cleverest and most competent of the gods, realize this. Guys, there are people that compare Loki in Norse mythology as like a Jesus figure in that mythos. He ultimately sacrifices himself in order to save the world. And of course, One Piece fans out there will realize that comparing Loki to Jesus and the sun god, which is already a thing, there's something here. I feel as though Oda has been researching himself some Loki conspiracy theories. But yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail because I feel like I'm gonna mess it up, but you're free to look this stuff up on your own. This is a thing. And I think that it'll ultimately end up being relevant to the story of One Piece. For me personally, I think that there has to be a reason that the Loki in One Piece claims to be the sun god. It almost seems as if he views this title similar to how Luffy views being king of the pirates. It's his destiny. And I guess I find it likely that prophecy has something to do with this. There's a prophecy about Joy Boy, the sun god, and some event in Elbaf, leading to its destruction. And I think that Oda has already foreshadowed that the giants of Elbaf as a whole are aware of this prophecy. Because they tell us in no uncertain terms that if Loki were to ever be free, it would mean the end of Elbaf. Or actually, they say it would be the end of everything. I think that Oda is capturing the lore of Loki in the sense that he is both the bringer of destruction and the savior of the world. Because he's following in the footsteps of the prophecy of Joy Boy and the sun god, who is foretold to do the same. Or maybe as Whitebeard says it in Marineford, somebody someday is going to turn the world upside down. That person is Luffy. But yeah, I feel like we're way out in space right now. Let's try and ground this back in reality. I would just say that I find Loki as a character right now to be really interesting, and my expectation is that this arc is ultimately going to boil down to sun god versus sun god. Different interpretations, or in Luffy's case, lack thereof, of a prophecy of what's going to happen to Elbaf, which ultimately will happen, if not in the way that everybody expects. This also works incredibly well with my already established headcanon link in the description that Blackbeard is also a Joy Boy candidate, and basically Blackbeard and Luffy reflect two sides of the same coin. Blackbeard to Luffy will be very similar to the conversation we've just had about Loki and Luffy. Or to boil it down really simply, it's evil Joy Boy versus good Joy Boy. Also, these comparisons between Blackbeard and Loki make a lot of sense because Loki is associated with darkness, and he also, his story revolves around stealing a particular fruit. But outside of what might happen in the future, how exactly Loki got to this position to begin with is itself a flashback, a story I want to see. I think that it's easy to miss this, but Loki is still relatively young. He was born sometime during Big Mom's flashback in Elbaf, which occurred roughly 66 years ago. So Loki is roughly 66 years old. But in giant terms, that's still really young. If you say that one of the elder giants is 400 years old, and that in human years is basically a 100-year-old person, then being 66 would make Loki approximately 20 in human years. So killing your own father by age 20 is kind of a feat, and you wonder what might have inspired somebody to do this. Of course, the legends or the stories that we have from the giants of Elbaf is that he was just attracted to darkness. From the very moment he was born, he was known as the Accursed Prince. But I find in the story of One Piece that this is rarely the case, especially if Oda draws upon the mythology of the actual Loki. Complicated, not evil. So I guess my headcanon right now is, and how I choose to look at this, is that misfortune has followed Loki since the moment that he was born. You could begin this story with something like Loki's mother dying in childbirth, giving birth to Loki, which is commonly in stories depicted as a bad omen. We know for a fact that Oda has read Game of Thrones, and this is also the story of Tyrion Lannister. Tyrion Lannister is also very similar to Loki. Also around the time of Loki's birth, we know that Big Mom went on a rampage and killed one of the elder giants, and then soon thereafter Mother Carmel died. So my opinion is from the moment of Loki's birth, the giants of Elbaf kind of hated him, which is the origin story of a very intriguing character. But anyway, I'm not entirely sure how to segue this, so we're just gonna go ahead and do it. Right now, a question that we should have is, who is the current leader of Elbaf? To me, it seems obvious it isn't Hajrudin. We know it's not Hajrudin and Loki's father, Harold, because he's dead. And aside from this, we don't know anything else. But what we do know is that approximately 10 years ago, there was an arranged marriage between Loki and Lola, a member of the Big Mom Pirates. Guys, the giants hate Big Mom. I don't think that they would have supported an arranged marriage with their prince. The way that this makes the most sense to me is that this arranged marriage came about because Loki wanted it. Because at the time, Loki already was king. So this arranged marriage happened after Loki killed his own father and acquired this legendary devil fruit. So if you assume this to be true, and it's speculative, I understand, but if you assume this to be true, then the giants didn't immediately imprison him. There was a time where he ruled. But in this made-up story, we're still lacking one key element of like the real reason why Loki was so determined for this devil fruit and really his motivation for killing the king. I mentioned this in my last chapter review, but I like the thought a lot that Pandora, Mother Carmel's homie, is still alive and in Elbaf. The justification for this is a little bit of a stretch, but I find it persuasive nonetheless. We've already compared Loki to Kaido. And beyond this, I think that there's a lot of comparisons to be found with the island of Wano in Elbaf, not least of which is the character of Odin. And in several videos across my channel, we've talked about Kaido as a failed Joy Boy candidate, or a near Joy Boy, or an evil Joy Boy, in the very same way that we have described Blackbeard and Loki. An argument can be made that by the end, Kaido began to believe himself to be Joy Boy, and that the destruction of the world was part of his destiny. Basically, Kaido wanted Joy Boy to exist, and Joy Boy was either going to exist and come and stop him, or Kaido would be Joy Boy, and the world would face the consequences of that. But anyway, Kaido had somebody to guide him, Kurozumi Higurashi. This character was extremely present in Odin's flashback in Wano, but is also a character that isn't really fleshed out in great detail. But we're given the impression that this was Kaido's right-hand person that was basically manipulating him or leading him. Kaido was the brawn and Higurashi was the brain. It's also really cool because Higurashi similarly manipulated Kurozumi Orochi. So this person was the real mastermind to so much history that has occurred. And she was also a member of the Rocks Pirates. But yeah, anyway, basically the idea is that there's somebody very similar to Higurashi in Loki's life, manipulating him, instructing him, leading him. And I am absolutely in love with the thought right now that this is Pandora, Mother Carmel's homie, who is the actual current leader of Elbaf. And fittingly, because it is a ball of fire, it is the current sun god of Elbaf, after it betrayed Loki to acquire this title. But yeah, I feel like that this is something that I should probably explain in more detail because it's a little out there. But I suppose the shortest way to explain my love for the theory is that it involves the Big Mom Pirates, Big Mom's history, and that sort of thing. It would add layers to Elbaf that I'm here for. But if you don't like any of this and you just want something to take away, it's that I do see similarities between Wano and Elbaf. Some we've already pointed out at the beginning of the review with the fact that in Wano the borders were closed and nobody could leave the island, but in Elbaf the borders are also closed, but it's because nobody can enter. Seems pretty likely that by the conclusion of Elbaf, the borders will be opened, one way or another. The arrival of Joy Boy was also, I would say, the most important aspect of Wano. And likewise, Joy Boy and the Sun God seems to be an important component of this arc. If you would say that Joy Boy first appeared in Wano, then I feel like in Elbaf is the arc where Joy Boy is first acknowledged, where people, specifically the giants, will begin to actually worship him. We also have an interesting inversion, which is that in Wano, Luffy arrived and the heroes of the past were unable to defeat the monster Kaido. But when we arrive in Elbaf, we find the monster chained up. The heroes of Elbaf were able to win. And it is most likely, I'm sorry guys, it is most likely, Luffy is gonna find a way to free Loki, because it do be like that. Also, I guess while we're here, another arc to potentially look at as a comparison to Elbaf right now is Drum Island. This was actually something that Chopper brought up explicitly in the chapter of like, look, I'm used to climbing these sorts of bridges. And this was true from his time in Drum Kingdom. Drum Kingdom, you should think about the drums of liberation in Joy Boy. It is also an icy mountainous island. And there's actually a really cool theory out there that I believe was made by Denden Kushi, but basically the mountains of Drum Kingdom are not actually mountains, and they are all cut down giant trees that are frozen over so you can no longer tell, which in relation to Elbaf would be an awesome parallel. But yeah, mainly story-wise, the similarity that we have between Drum Kingdom and Elbaf right now is that Drum Kingdom was the arc where the Strats arrived and the evil king was already deposed, Wapol. And then Wapol returned, which is basically what we expect of Loki. There's more that I will probably bring up when the chapters of Elbaf actually unfold and the similarities are there to point out specifically. But just something to think about. But yeah, it's crazy. We're 35 minutes into the review and I still haven't talked about Yggdrasil. Guys, the reveal of the entirety of the island of Elbaf and the tree in full was spectacular. In some ways, it wasn't exactly what we thought, because for years and years we speculated that this tree would be like reaching up into the clouds and connect with the Sky Islands, and based on the panel that we get in this chapter, that theory does not seem right. But it in no way takes away from how awesome I think that this arc is, visually. It's even the little stuff, man. Like, you will know, we made a big deal about the invisible structures that were present in the panel of Elbaf from Big Mom's flashback. Like, something invisible is there. And looking at it in full, it seems really likely that those invisible structures were actually waterfalls. Waterfalls majestically cascading off the side of this giant tree. And I'm over here thinking to myself, like, when Oda drew this 7 years ago, he was thinking to himself, how the hell do I draw these waterfalls? In a way which is accurate and makes sense. And it just demonstrates how next level that dude is. But I suppose that you already know that I can be the king of cope. I definitely still want Elbaf to in some way relate to Jack and the Giant Beanstalk and relate to like the actual Sky Islands. There is still a Chekhov's gun in the story about a normal entrance to the Sky Islands that the Straw Hats didn't use. The knockup stream was not the normal way that you would reach the Sky Islands. So I want to find what the normal way actually is, and I always assumed it to be climbing the tree in Elbaf. And the last bit of hope that we have about this is that, you know, coincidence or not, when Oda decided to draw the panel, which shows us all of Elbaf, the top of it is cut off. So there could potentially be another layer of the tree above where we can see. And frankly, I expect this regardless in some way because we already know that this tree in Elbaf is Yggdrasil. You can go ahead right now and Google search images of Yggdrasil. The tree effectively has 3 levels. You have the base and the roots. You have the middle of the tree, which is Midgard, and then the top of the tree, which is Asgard. But the Yggdrasil in One Piece currently only has 2 levels. You have the base and the island of Elbaf, and then you have the parent place where the giants live in the middle. So I think that there is more tree above, or probably more likely, there is more tree below. Given that we now know that the world flooded, right? If this tree was growing since the beginning, then there would be more tree below and an entire world has already flooded. Its actual base and roots. Either way, I'm secretly hoping that Oda can weave in some story to the people that originally lived at the bottom of the tree before the world flooded. Or potentially, if it was planted after the world flooded, Oda still has another level to reveal. But yeah, I suppose we only have odds and ends left to mention about the chapter. I brought this up very early on in the review, but Gerd and Goldberg do not seem to be big fans of Road. They call him a bigger shame to Elbaf than even Loki. So this in my mind makes me compare Loki to Road. And really the defining characteristic that makes Road so kind of disgusting is his desire to lord over humans. I think this would also be a fitting perspective for Loki to have. Remember, Lola rejected Loki, Lola being a human. It's fair to wonder that as a result of this event, Loki then would hate humans. Some dudes don't take rejection very well. That would seem intuitive to me. Road and Loki also clearly had the hots for human women, which is another comparison. Basically, I think that Nami might need to watch her back. There's also this weird honor hierarchy that seems to exist within Elbaf that I feel like should be pointed out. Hajrudin is a literal prince, but he was below the rank of Dory and Brogy. When it came to who was going to help out Luffy and Egghead, Dory and Brogy got dibs. But I think that if you're perceptive, you'll notice an inconsistency. Dory and Brogy are pirates. Hajrudin is a pirate. Pirates don't need to ask for permission to do what it is that they want to do. It's kind of a rule of being a pirate. To me, there seems to be this like general rule in Elbaf that everybody follows that there is only allowed to be one pirate crew and one pirate captain, which in my mind makes them less similar to actual pirates and more similar to something like the Marines. Elbaf is an incredibly ancient place, and giants are incredibly long-lived. We know of one alive right now that is 400 years old. His great-grandfather very likely lived during the Void Century. So with so few generations passing, what we're witnessing here in Elbaf is something of a relic of the past. In a human timeline, this is something like 700 years ago. But to get to the point, we know that Joy Boy was a pirate. We speculate that at some point in time, Joy Boy became the king of the pirates and essentially ruled over the world, so the giant warrior pirates might reflect pirates that you would have seen during the Void Century. Maybe these pirates were less like pirates that we would find today, and more like the Marines. The captain of the giant warrior pirates is effectively the fleet admiral of the Elbaf fleet. Their orders are law. And this also creates an interesting narrative for Hajrudin himself, because if this is the case, then he's not free, which might end up being a part of this story. To return to comparisons with Wano, Hajrudin, a prince, desires to leave his island and become a pirate, just like Odin. But maybe this is the story of Odin with a few dashes of Momonosuke. Hajrudin, just the same as Odin, eventually found his way out of Elbaf, but his story was remarkably less legendary. He's not particularly notorious. He ended up getting captured in Dressrosa. He joined Buggy's delivery service thing, which is like not the most impressive thing ever. And now that Dory and Brogy have returned, he's not even the captain of the giant warrior pirates anymore. And the only noteworthy event is pledging his allegiance to the Straw Hats, who outclass him in every way. So a very cool inversion of Wano and Elbaf is that Hajrudin has his Odin story. It just starts now, in the present. But anyway, guys, I think that I've rambled on for long enough today. I think that's everything that I had to say. If I missed anything, be sure to let me know. As always, I'm curious as to what you think. Share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.